Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask a question. Let me ask all of you, if you could please be concise in the answer. A question on a point I made earlier. The President wants to end the Food for Peace program. I don't think that's a good idea. He wants to eliminate it as a standalone program. He says that emergency food assistance will instead come out of the International Disaster Assistance account. Is this a good idea or a bad idea, Mr. Natsios?
Congressman, when I was the head of the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau in which the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance and Food for Peace was, this was under Bush 41, 28 years ago, we considered merging not the accounts, but the staffs of Food for Peace and OFDA, because there's tension. I understand they moved into the same building, and there's been a huge drop in the tension levels, the friction that exists between Federal offices since they're co-located. So I would actually support a merger of the two offices, which is under serious consideration, but not an abolition of the Food for Peace law or the appropriation level or the expertise that Food for Peace has in food security. People think that all the Food for Peace staff does is ship food out. That's just not true. They're experts in nutrition. They're experts in the balance you need when you feed people. You can't just feed them all grain. You have to give them fat. You also have to, in the form of food, vegetable oil, and you also have to give them protein in the form of beans. And you have to monitor that. You have to set up systems for monitoring this to make sure that the food is getting where it's supposed to get. So that expertise cannot be lost. And so I strongly support the continuation of the Food for Peace account, the Food for Peace program, but believe it should be more flexible. Let me just add one piece of empirical evidence that we have. Dan Honig is a young academic at SAIS, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in D.C. He's just come out with a book that studied 10,000 aid projects from 9 different aid agencies, including AID, DFID, the British Aid Agency, and he asked the question, those which are highly centralized in their headquarters versus those that are highly decentralized, what's the failure rate of the programs? And he concludes that particularly in unstable and rapid changing circumstances, which is certainly the case in disaster response, that the failure rate increases dramatically if the decisions are made in the capital or the headquarters. And if they're highly decentralized, and you give maximum flexibility to the offices in the field, you have a much higher success rate. So we now have enormous empirical research to support what seems to be common sense. Sometimes what common sense can't be proved. This case, we can prove it.
Thank you. Dr. Lenz.
I would agree that the Food for Peace program should be maintained. I think Mr. Natsios covered it really well. So.
Thank you. Mr. Glickman.
And I would add McGovern-Dole to that as well, that should be maintained. But here's the problem. There probably are some bureaucratic problems in terms of implementation. You talk to the NGOs, and they really have to go through a lot of bureaucratic gobbledygook to kind of figure out which account they're going into and which they're not. But if this were offered without a 29% reduction in money, I might be willing to sit down and talk to them about some of these changes. But the elimination of Food for Peace and McGovern-Dole and others, frankly, is just a way to reduce the amount of money we spend in those areas. So that's one of the real reasons why I wouldn't support it.
I agree with you, and that's why I'm so worried about it. Mr. Glickman, let me ask you this. Many would argue that the U.S. comparative advantage in responding to international food needs is through its ability to produce an abundant food supply. When America provides homegrown food, it's supporting the U.S. farmer, as well as U.S. food producers, processors, and shippers, and yet in-kind food aid, as we've heard here, is relatively slow to arrive and costly when compared with cash-based alternatives. So in your view, what's the appropriate balance here? What's the appropriate balance between in-kind and cash-based food assistance?
I think it depends on the nature of the purpose of where the food is going. So if it's dealing with a typhoon or an earthquake, the majority probably ought to be in form of in-kind commodities. Just you got to get the food there as quickly as possible, and it still takes too long to get there. But if you're trying to build local economies, or if you have refugee camps like the Ethiopian camps or the camps in Lebanon. And of course, a lot of the people in Jordan actually live in Amman. There are several 100,000 people there, and they get most of their food through the vouchers, the EBT. Then you almost have to go the way of using local purchases or EBT cards, that kind of thing. So it's just the whole thing, you've got to be flexible with it. I think the American farmers want to help feed the world, and we provide the commodities to do that. But I think that more American farmers are realizing that there are many ways to skin this cat, not just one way.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel.